My phone vibrated once in my hand as the church doors waited to open. Just one sharp buzz, quiet final. I glanced down expecting a reminder or a well-wish. Instead, I read a sentence that split my chest open without making a sound. "I'm not coming. You're a disgrace to this family." It was from my father, on my wedding day. I didn't scream, I didn't cry. I just stood there in my dress blues medals cold against my skin while the music swelled, and a lifetime of silence suddenly found its voice. The organist struck the first note just as I locked my phone. The sound rolled through the chapel like a tide, slow and deliberate, echoing off stone walls and stained glass. Outside the sanctuary, guests were rising to their feet, programs rustling shoes scuffing softly against polished floors. Inside the vestibule, everything felt suspended flowers arranged with impossible care, ivory ribbons tied just tight enough, the air faintly scented with lilies and old wood. I stood alone in that small, beautiful space, bouquet steady in my left hand, my right still warm from the phone. I was wearing my army dress blues. The jacket had been pressed to perfection, the seams sharp, the brass buttons catching fragments of colored light as the sun filtered through the glass. 4 ribbons sat above my heart, neat and unassuming. On my shoulders, the silver oak leaves marked my rank. Lieutenant Colonel. I had earned every inch of that uniform, every sleepless night, every mile logged, every order given when hesitation could have cost lives. I had chosen it deliberately weeks ago when everyone else was debating lace and trains and veils. This wasn't a statement for the room, it was a statement to myself. I read the message again in my head as if repetition might soften it. It didn't. The words landed the way bad news sometimes does, not with fireworks, but with a dull thud, like the moment before a collision when your body knows something terrible is coming and has no time to react. I'd faced live fire without flinching. I'd coordinated evacuations under pressure that made grown men freeze. None of that felt like this. I shouldn't have been surprised. My father hadn't RSVP'd. He hadn't called. He hadn't even sent a card. Still, some foolish part of me had believed that today of all days he might show up, that seeing me standing tall, marrying a man who respected who I was, and what I did might finally shift something in him. I'd imagined catching his eye from the aisle, imagined a nod, a concession, anything that said, "I see you now." Instead, I got a text. My fingers trembled just enough to notice. I exhaled slowly, the way they teach you to when everything inside wants to surge forward at once. Control the breath. Control the moment. Don't let the noise in your head dictate your next move. "Hey," Mark said gently. I hadn't heard him approach. He was a few steps away, straightening his tie in front of the antique mirror, his reflection calm, focused. He looked exactly the way he always did when he was thinking 3 moves ahead, shoulders relaxed, eyes steady, the faintest crease between his brows. He took one look at my face and crossed the distance without rushing. "What is it?" he asked. I didn't trust my voice, so I handed him the phone. He read the message once. His jaw tightened for a heartbeat, just long enough for me to see it, then eased. He gave the phone back, leaned down, and kissed my forehead with the same quiet certainty he brought to everything. "Give it 2 hours," he said. I blinked. 2 hours. He smiled, that knowing smile that had pulled me in the first time we met. Not smug, not dramatic, just assured. He reached into his jacket, pulled out his own phone, tapped the screen once, and stepped aside. I didn't hear what he said. He kept his voice low, even the way he did when he was solving a problem rather than reacting to it. The call was brief. When he ended it, he slipped the phone back into his pocket and took my hands in both of his. "Let's not give your father another inch of today," he said softly. "You deserve the whole thing." I swallowed, nodded, and squared my shoulders. The doors opened. The sanctuary fell quiet, not because of my uniform, not because anyone was surprised, but because of the way I walked. I didn't rush. I didn't hesitate. I moved down the aisle with purpose, boots silent against the floor, bouquet, steady spine straight. Faces blurred into a warm wash of color, friends, family, colleagues who had shown up when it mattered. I caught Mark's eye at the altar, and the look he gave me then was everything my father had never managed to offer: pride without conditions. The ceremony was simple, sacred. The words carried weight without excess, each vow spoken clearly, deliberately. I didn't cry, not until Mark reached for my hand, and his thumb brushed over the small callus near my trigger finger, like he understood the path that had led me here better than anyone else ever had. When we kissed, something in my chest finally unclenched. For the first time that day, I felt whole. It wasn't until the reception that my phone found its way back into my awareness. We were halfway through our first dance, the band playing something slow and familiar, when my maid of honor hurried over, eyes wide. "Rachel," she whispered, pressing the phone into my hand. "Your phone's been going crazy." I looked down. 38 missed calls. All from one number. Dad. Mark leaned in just enough for me to hear him over the music. 2 hours, he murmured. And in that moment, standing there under soft lights with his hand warm at my back and my father's name lighting up the screen, I realized something fundamental had shifted. Whatever silence had ruled my life until now, it was no longer mine to carry. I didn't answer the phone. Not during the dance. Not when the song ended and applause rippled politely through the room. Not when someone pressed a champagne flute into my hand and said something about how beautiful everything was. I slipped the phone into the small pocket sewn into my jacket, lining the one meant for documents, not emergencies, and let the music carry me forward. Mark noticed, of course, he always did. "You okay?" he asked quietly as we stepped aside, giving the band room to reset. "I don't know yet," I said honestly. He nodded like that answer made perfect sense. "Then we don't decide anything yet." That was Mark. He didn't rush emotions. He treated them the way he treated blueprints and timelines, things that needed space to reveal their shape. The reception unfolded in gentle layers. Laughter at the bar, a clink of silverware. My aunt dabbing her eyes during the toast. Someone telling a story about basic training that made half the table laugh and the other half wince. I smiled when it was appropriate. I listened. I stayed present. And every so often, like a distant tremor, I felt the vibration of my phone against my side. I ignored it every time. By the time we cut the cake, the number had climbed higher. I didn't look. I didn't need to. It wasn't until later, after the last song, after the hugs and handshakes and the soft chaos of goodbyes, that I finally excused myself. The bridal suite was quiet, tucked away from the noise. The lights dimmed low. I closed the door behind me and leaned back against it for a moment, letting the silence settle. I took the phone out. 38 missed calls. A handful of voicemails. All from him. I sat on the edge of the tufted bench bouquet resting beside me and pressed play on the first message. "Rachel, call me when you get this." His voice was clipped, controlled. The voice of a man used to being obeyed. The second message followed minutes later. "I may have overreacted. We should talk." The third came with a hitch in his breath. "Rachel, please, something's happened." By the fourth, the control was gone. Just call me." I stared at the screen, my reflection faint and warped in the glass. The uniform that had felt like armor all day suddenly felt heavy. The metals pressed into my chest when I leaned forward, a physical reminder of everything I had earned and everything my father had refused to see. There was a knock at the door. Soft, respectful. Mark stepped in when I opened it. His jacket was off now, tie loosened, sleeves rolled just enough to show he'd shifted out of formal mode without losing his edge. He took one look at my face and sat beside me. "How many?" he asked. 38, I said. He let out a quiet breath. He's persistent. "What did you do?" I asked, not accusing, just needing to understand. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket and handed me his phone. "Check your alerts." My hands shook just a little as I unlocked it. I opened the browser and typed my name, half expecting nothing, half expecting everything. The headline filled the screen. Lieutenant Colonel Rachel Whitmore, the service behind the silence. It was front page. A full feature. My photo at the top, saluting beside my unit son, cutting sharp lines across the image. Below it, words I recognized from old citations and after-action reports, now woven into something larger. 16 years of service, deployments, commendations. The convoy operation in Kandahar where 14 personnel made it home because we rerouted under fire. The Bronze Star. The leadership training. the quiet nomination that had never been public before. I felt my throat close. "I thought they weren't publishing this until next month," I whispered. "They weren't," Mark said evenly. "I made a call." I looked at him. Really looked. "You leaked it." "I expedited the truth," he corrected gently. "Your father wanted to define today as disgrace. I figured it was time the rest of the world saw who you actually are." I laughed, then a soft fractured sound that surprised me. "You turned my wedding into a media event." He shook his head. "No, I leveled the battlefield." I leaned into him, forehead resting against his shoulder, and for the first time all day I let myself feel it. The exhaustion, the release, the strange mix of vindication and grief. This wasn't revenge. It didn't taste sharp or sweet. It felt inevitable. By morning, the story was everywhere. Other outlets picked it up. Veterans groups shared it. Former commanders commented. A retired general posted a short note that read, "One of the finest officers I ever had the privilege to serve beside." My phone buzzed nonstop with messages from people I hadn't spoken to in years, some congratulatory, some apologetic, all tinged with the same realization they hadn't known. And now they did. My father called again around noon. This time I answered. "Rachel." His voice was strained, stripped of its usual authority. I saw the article." "I assumed you would," I said. There was a pause. "What I said yesterday, what I texted, it was out of line." "You didn't understand," I said quietly. "No," he admitted. "I didn't want to." He asked if he could see me. Just talk. I gave him the name of a cafe down the block, neutral ground. 30 minutes, I said. That's all I can promise. When I hung up, Mark was watching me carefully. "You sure?" he asked. "No," I said, "but I'm tired of carrying the silence." As I grabbed my jacket and headed for the door, my phone buzzed again. Another missed call, then another. I didn't look at the number this time. I already knew. For the first time in my life, my father wasn't calling to pass judgment. He was calling because he had lost control of the narrative, and he didn't know how to stand without it. The cafe was already half full when I arrived. Late morning light poured through the front windows, catching dust in the air and turning it gold. The place smelled like roasted beans and warm pastries, the kind of ordinary comfort that made conversations feel safer than they were. I chose a table near the window, ordered tea, and sat with my hands wrapped around the cup watching people pass outside. Couples, parents with strollers. A man in a suit talking too loudly on his phone. Life moving forward uninterrupted. My father walked in exactly 7 minutes later. I recognized him instantly, of course. The posture was the same, back straight, shoulders squared, steps measured. He wore a charcoal gray suit pressed to perfection, and a pale blue shirt without a tie, as if he'd tried to soften himself at the last minute, and didn't quite know how. What stopped me wasn't his appearance, though. It was his face. For the first time I could remember, he hesitated. He scanned the room like someone entering unfamiliar territory, eyes flicking from table to table until they landed on me. When our gazes met, something in him faltered, just slightly. Enough that I noticed, enough that it mattered. "Rachel," he said when he reached the table. "Dad." He sat, cleared his throat, and folded his hands together, fingers interlaced. A courtroom habit. He'd spent 40 years doing that, arranging himself into a position of authority before speaking. Today it looked more like armor than command. "I'll be direct," he began. "What I said yesterday was wrong." I lifted a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "Before you go any further, I need you to listen." He blinked, clearly not used to being interrupted, then nodded once. "All right." "What you sent me wasn't just about a wedding," I said. My voice was steady even. I'd had a lifetime of practice delivering hard truths without raising my volume. It was about everything you've never said. Every time you chose silence. Every time you decided who I was without asking. His jaw tightened. He didn't argue. "You didn't just miss a ceremony," I continued. "You missed a lifetime of becoming." That landed. I saw it in the way his shoulders stiffened, in the way his eyes dropped to his hands. For a moment he looked older than I remembered. Smaller. Not weak, just human. "I thought I was protecting you," he said finally. "The military, it's harsh. I've seen what it does to people. I didn't want that life for you." It didn't break me, I said. It built me. He looked up, then really looked. I see that now. No, I said softly. You see it because everyone else does. Because it's in print. Because it has headlines. Silence stretched between us, thick but not hostile. The waitress passed by, refilling water glasses, blissfully unaware that decades of tension were unfolding 2 feet from her elbow. When your mother died, my father said slowly, I lost my balance. I doubled down on structure, on expectations. I thought if I could keep everything ordered, nothing else would fall apart. I remembered my mother clearly, her quiet presence, the way she listened more than she spoke, the way she smoothed rough edges without announcing it. When she was gone, the house had felt sharper, louder, like all the soft things had been removed. You wanted me to go to Yale, I said. He nodded. It was a good path. I enlisted instead. His lips pressed into a thin line. I know. You didn't speak to me for 2 years. Another nod, smaller this time. Basic training was the first place I ever felt free, I said. There were rules, yes, but they were clear. They weren't used to control me. They were used to keep people alive. I told him about the early mornings, the exhaustion, the strange comfort of knowing exactly what was expected of me. I told him about learning to lead, about discovering that I could stay calm when everything around me was chaos, about the pride I'd felt the first time someone trusted me with their safety. He listened, actually listened. No interruptions, no rebuttals. I sent you photos, I said. Graduations, promotions, awards. You never responded. I didn't know how he said hoarsely. That's not the same as trying. He exhaled long and slow. I thought if I ignored it, you'd come back, that eventually you'd realize it was a mistake. And when I didn't. Then I told myself it was rebellion, or stubbornness, anything but success. I let that sit between us. Do you know what hurt the most, I asked? Not that you disagreed with my choices. It was that you never showed up, not once, not even to see who I'd become. His hands clenched on the table. I was wrong. The words were quiet, unadorned, not a performance. I'm not asking for forgiveness today, I said. I'm setting boundaries. He looked at me, eyes searching. What does that mean? If you want a place in my life now, it's on my terms, I said. Respect first, apology second, and you don't get to skip either. He nodded. Slowly, I understand. After a moment, he asked, There's a brunch tomorrow, after the reception. Could I come? I'd sit in the back. I wouldn't make a scene. I studied him, the man who had once commanded rooms with a glance, who had decided my future before I was old enough to vote, now asking, not assuming. Yes, I said at last, you can come. Relief flickered across his face, not triumph, not entitlement, just relief. When we stood to leave, there was no hug, no dramatic reconciliation, just a brief nod from each of us, an acknowledgement that something had shifted even if it wasn't settled. As I stepped back onto the sidewalk, the sun felt warmer than before. I wasn't carrying his judgment anymore. And for the first time, I realized how heavy it had been. I didn't tell Mark everything that was said at the cafe. Not right away. Some conversations need air before they can be translated. They need to settle to lose their sharpest edges. We walked back to the hotel side by side, the city humming around us, and he didn't press. He never did. He waited until I was ready, and when I finally spoke, it came out in fragments, what my father admitted, what he didn't, the way his voice had sounded when he asked to sit in the back. Mark listened without interrupting his expression, thoughtful, unreadable, in the way that meant he was already mapping consequences. I didn't plan for all of this to spiral, he said when I finished, but I knew one thing for sure. What's that? He was counting on silence, Mark said. People like your father always do. We sat on the edge of the bed, shoes kicked off the room, still scattered with evidence of the day garment bags, flowers in water-filled vases, cards stacked neatly on the dresser. Outside, traffic moved in steady waves, headlights blinking on as dusk crept in. He spent his entire life controlling narratives, Mark continued. Courtrooms, opinions, reputations. He didn't expect the truth to move faster than he could. I thought of the calls, the voicemails, the sudden shift from judgment to urgency. So you just called the press? Mark smiled faintly. Not exactly. He explained it the way he explained everything methodically without drama. He hadn't cold called a newsroom. He'd reached out to Jim McAllister, an old college friend who now edited a national paper's service and leadership column. They'd talked years ago about doing a profile on military leadership in non-traditional spaces, logistics, coordination, decision-making under pressure. My name had come up then, quietly, respectfully. I knew they had the file, Mark said, the interviews, the citations. They were waiting for a green light. And you gave it to them, I said. I told them it was time, he replied, that the story mattered now. I leaned back against the headboard, staring at the ceiling. You realize he's going to think you did this to punish him? Mark shrugged. He can think whatever he wants. This wasn't about him. That was the thing about Mark. He never centered himself as the hero. He didn't even center himself as the avenger. He centered the truth. Everything else was collateral. By the next morning, the ripple had become a wave. The article wasn't just shared, it was discussed, commented on, quoted. Other outlets followed up, adding context, pulling in voices from units I'd served with, commanders who spoke plainly about competence and trust. A retired colonel wrote a short piece titled "Leadership You Don't See Coming." A veterans organization reposted it with a caption that read, "This is what service looks like." My phone became unusable. Messages stacked on messages. Some were congratulations, others were apologies from relatives who'd once nodded along with my father's assessments, from acquaintances who'd made jokes about playing soldier. A few came from young women in uniform thanking me for showing them what was possible. Through it all, my father stayed quiet. No calls, no messages. That silence felt different from the ones before. This wasn't dismissal. This was recalibration. At brunch the next day, he arrived alone. The room was warm and informal, long tables, coffee cups, pastries disappearing faster than anyone could track. Mark and I moved easily through it, laughing, listening, accepting congratulations. I saw my father near the back, exactly where he'd said he'd sit. He didn't approach, he didn't try to reclaim space. He watched. People noticed him, of course. In our hometown, the Whitmore name carried weight. Whispers followed him like a shadow. I didn't watch his reaction. I didn't need to. This wasn't my reckoning to manage. Later that afternoon, as the crowd thinned, Mark leaned in and said quietly, "You don't have to do anything." I know, I said, and I meant it. The real consequence came days later. A local paper ran a small piece, buried but unmistakable. Retired judge's absence raises questions after daughter's wedding. It didn't accuse. It didn't sensationalize. It simply laid out facts that had never been placed side by side before. Service record, public snub, silence. That was enough. My father had spent decades believing that control was strength. Now he was learning the cost of mistaking it for respect. He didn't call again that week. Instead, I received a letter. It was handwritten, the paper thick, the ink precise. He didn't apologize outright. Not yet. He acknowledged harm. He acknowledged blindness. He wrote about pride the way a lawyer might, carefully, as if naming it too directly might give it more power than it deserved. At the end, he wrote one sentence that stopped me cold. "I am beginning to understand that silence can be its own kind of cruelty." I folded the letter and set it aside. That night, Mark and I sat on the balcony, city lights flickering below. "Do you regret it?" I asked him. "Making the call." He shook his head, no. "Even knowing it might cost him?" Mark looked at me, then really looked. "It didn't cost him anything he wasn't already spending," he said. "It just stopped him from spending it on you." I thought about that long after he went inside. Because for the first time, the power dynamic had shifted without shouting, without confrontation, without spectacle. The truth had simply stepped into the light and refused to move. And my father, for all his training in argument and authority, was left with nothing to say. The cafe meeting hadn't ended anything. If anything, it had opened a door neither of us knew how to walk through yet. The week after the wedding moved quickly, as weeks often do when life decides not to wait for emotional closure. Thank you notes piled up on the kitchen table. Flowers wilted one by one. Mark returned to work with the same steady focus he brought to everything, while I reported back to base to finish out a transition period I'd postponed for the wedding. On the surface, things looked normal. Underneath, something was shifting. I heard it first through other people. A cousin called to check in, her voice carefully neutral, as if she didn't want to say too much and risk choosing the wrong side. An old family friend sent a message that began with, "I hope you know how proud we all are," followed by a pause long enough to feel deliberate. Even my aunt, my father's sister, usually the quietest of the lot, left a voicemail that ended with, "He's having a hard time." Not that it excuses anything. I didn't respond to any of it. Not because I was angry, but because I finally understood something I'd missed for years. Explaining myself had never changed the outcome. It had only delayed my own peace. My father didn't call. He didn't text. He didn't send another letter. And that silence, this one, wasn't punishment. It was reckoning. 2 weeks after the wedding, I was invited to speak at a small veterans leadership forum. Nothing flashy. A panel discussion in a municipal building with folding chairs and bad coffee, the kind of event that mattered because of who was in the room, not who wrote about it afterward. I almost declined. Public attention still felt strange, like wearing someone else's jacket. Mark encouraged me to go. "You don't owe them anything," he said, "but you owe yourself the chance to say what you believe." So I went. I talked about service without romance, about decisions made in narrow windows, about leadership as responsibility, not authority. I spoke plainly the way I always had, and when it was over, the applause wasn't loud, but it was sincere. As I stepped off the small stage, I saw him. My father stood near the back, hands folded in front of him, posture familiar and foreign all at once. He hadn't been on the program. He hadn't told me he was coming. He hadn't tried to sit up front. He waited until the room thinned before approaching. "Rachel," he said. I nodded, "Dad." He looked older than he had at the cafe. Not weaker, just worn in a way that suggested he'd been thinking too much and sleeping too little. "You spoke well," he said. "You always did." I let that pass. Compliments without accountability had lost their currency. "I didn't come to interrupt," he added. "I just wanted to listen." "That's new," I said gently. He didn't argue. "It is." We stood there for a moment, the hum of cleanup around us. Chairs stacking, voices fading. Finally he said, "I've been asked to step down from one of my board appointments." I raised an eyebrow. "Asked?" He gave a thin smile, strongly encouraged. There it was, the consequence he hadn't anticipated. Not public shaming, not disgrace in the dramatic sense, just the slow erosion of unquestioned authority. "How do you feel about that?" I asked. He considered the question carefully. "Embarrassed," he said. Humbled, and if I'm honest, relieved. That surprised me. "I spent so long defending a version of myself that I forgot to examine it," he continued. "Now that I'm forced to, I see how narrow it was." I waited. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he said, echoing my words from the cafe. "I'm trying to understand what comes next." I met his gaze. "That depends on whether you're willing to listen when the answers aren't comfortable." He nodded. "I am." That was the closest we came to reconciliation that day. Over the next month, small things changed. He withdrew from another committee, quietly, no announcements. He began volunteering at a local VA legal clinic, offering guidance on benefits appeals and paperwork work that required patience rather than judgment. I heard about it through someone else, not from him. That felt intentional, appropriate. One afternoon, a thick envelope arrived in the mail. No return address. I recognized the handwriting immediately. Inside was a single-page letter. He wrote about the first case he'd helped a young man recently discharged, overwhelmed by forms and deadlines, convinced the system was designed to fail him. My father described listening more than speaking, resisting the urge to correct, to direct, to dominate the conversation. He admitted it had been harder than any courtroom cross-examination. At the end, he wrote, "I am learning that respect isn't reclaimed by argument. It's earned by attention." I sat with that letter for a long time. Not because it fixed anything, but because it showed movement. Mark noticed the change before I said anything. "You're lighter," he said one evening as we cleaned up after dinner. "I think I finally put something down," I replied. He smiled. "Good." The real test came at a small ceremony weeks later, when I was recognized by my unit for a transition assignment. I'd accepted a civilian-military liaison role focused on reintegration. It wasn't national news. It wasn't glamorous. But it mattered. As I stood at the podium looking out at familiar faces, I saw my father again, this time not at the back but off to the side, clearly uncertain where he belonged. He didn't approach afterward. He didn't speak. He simply watched, hands clasped, eyes steady. And for the first time I didn't feel the need to look back. Because the power had shifted not through confrontation but through consequence. Not through revenge but through release. The ceremony ended without fanfare. No speeches afterward, no press. Just a few handshakes, quiet congratulations, and the familiar ritual of folding chairs and stacking programs. It was the kind of ending that suited me, contained purposeful, complete. I changed out of my uniform in the locker room, running my fingers once over the ribbons before placing the jacket carefully in its garment bag. For years wearing it had felt like a shield. Lately it felt more like a mirror. Outside, the late afternoon air was crisp. Mark waited by the car, hands in his pockets, watching people drift past with the easy patience of someone who never felt the need to rush a moment. When he saw my expression, he smiled. "Ready?" he asked. "Yeah," I said, and for once it wasn't a complicated answer. Over the next few weeks, the aftershocks settled into something quieter, more deliberate. My father didn't reinsert himself into my life. He didn't call to offer advice. He didn't show up unannounced or test the boundaries I'd laid down. Instead, I heard about him through fragments, small updates passed along by others, the way news travels when it's no longer controlled by the person at its center. He'd officially stepped down from his remaining board positions. Not in protest, not with a statement. Just a letter of resignation effective immediately. People speculated, of course. They always do. But he didn't respond to any of it. He spent more time at the VA clinic. At first, he worked quietly, reviewing cases, helping veterans navigate appeals and benefits with the same meticulous attention he'd once reserved for constitutional arguments. Then slowly he began mentoring, teaching younger advocates how to prepare hearings, how to listen without interrupting, how to recognize when the law needed interpretation rather than enforcement. I learned all of this secondhand. And that mattered. Because for the first time, his actions weren't a performance for me. They weren't requests for absolution or attempts to rewrite the past. They were choices made without expectation of reward. One evening, a former colleague of his stopped me after a community event. "Your father talks about you differently now," she said carefully. Not as a point of pride, more like a lesson. I thanked her and let the conversation end there. At home, Mark and I settled into a rhythm that felt newly unburdened. Morning coffee on the balcony. Evenings spent cooking simple meals and talking about everything except what had already been said too many times. When the phone rang, my shoulders no longer tensed by reflex. The strangest part was the absence of triumph. I had imagined once that if my father ever lost the authority he'd wielded so effortlessly, it might feel like vindication. That seeing him humbled would restore some balance. Instead, what I felt was something closer to neutrality. Like watching a storm pass and realizing the ground beneath your feet was still solid. That was the price of pride. Not humiliation, not disgrace. Isolation. He had built his identity on certainty, on the belief that he knew best. When that certainty cracked, it didn't shatter him publicly. It simply left him standing alone with questions he'd never practiced answering. One afternoon, a package arrived at the house. Inside was a book. Not a legal text, not a memoir, a slim volume on restorative justice, dog-eared, annotated, clearly used. Inside the cover, he'd written a single line. "For when listening matters more than winning." There was no signature. I didn't call him after that. Not because I was withholding anything, but because I understood finally that repair didn't require constant contact. It required consistency, time, space for new patterns to form without being forced. Months passed. My work in the liaison role expanded, pulling me into conversations about policy gaps, reintegration failures, and the quiet ways people fell through systems designed without enough listening. I found myself drawing on skills I hadn't even known I'd developed, bridging perspectives, translating urgency into process, advocating without antagonizing. In many ways, I was doing what my father had always claimed to value. Just differently. At a small holiday gathering hosted by friends, someone asked casually, "So how's your dad doing?" I paused, considering the question. "He's learning," I said at last. And that felt accurate. The real moment of clarity came unexpectedly. I was cleaning out old files one evening when I found a box of letters I'd written over the years, unsent drafts, postcards, never-mailed notes composed in moments of hope or anger and set aside. I sat on the floor reading through them, tracing the arc of a daughter trying over and over to be understood. I didn't feel the need to send any of them anymore. I sealed the box and put it back on the shelf. That was when I knew the balance had been restored, not because my father had changed enough, but because I no longer needed him to. The cost of his pride had been distance. The reward of mine was peace. And peace, I was learning, was not passive. It was chosen, maintained, protected. Not with silence, but with clarity. The invitation arrived on thick cream paper, the kind reserved for moments meant to feel permanent. I recognized the seal before I read the words. It was a small national ceremony, formal, contained, deliberately understated. Not a spectacle, not a headline grabber. A recognition of service tied to transition work I'd been doing quietly for months, bridging gaps between active duty and civilian systems. The kind of work no one noticed until it failed. Mark read the letter over my shoulder. "You should go," he said simply. "I know," I replied. What I didn't say, what I didn't need to, was that part of me wondered whether my father would be there. Not because I needed him to be, but because his absence, once so loud, had become something I could finally hear clearly. The ceremony took place in a long, narrow hall with tall windows and polished stone floors. Flags lined the walls. The crowd was modest colleagues, a few officials, family members scattered among them. I wore my uniform again, not because it was required, but because it felt honest. When my name was called, I stood with purpose, not pride, purpose. The applause was steady, respectful. As I stepped forward, I felt the weight of the moment, not as validation, but as acknowledgement, of nights spent untangling systems, of conversations held in small rooms where nothing was glamorous and everything mattered. As I returned to my seat, I saw him. My father sat in the back row, hands folded, eyes fixed forward. He didn't raise a phone. He didn't look around to see who noticed him. He didn't smile when our eyes met. He simply nodded. After the ceremony, I lingered near a marble column waiting for Mark, who had been pulled into a conversation. That's when I sensed someone standing just outside my line of sight. "Rachel," my father said quietly. I turned. He looked older than I remembered. Not diminished, just worn in the way people are when they finally stop pretending they have all the answers. His suit was neat, but unremarkable. His voice steady, but careful. "I didn't come to make a scene," he continued. "I just wanted to witness it. To see you honored the way you always should have been." I studied him not as a daughter seeking approval, but as a woman deciding what she was willing to carry forward. "You didn't just miss the wedding," I said calmly. "You missed everything that led to it. The woman I became in the absence of your blessing." His eyes filled, though he didn't let the tears fall. "I know." We stood there, the sounds of conversation echoing faintly around us. Finally, he spoke again. "I was wrong. About the military, about you, about what strength looks like." I let the silence stretch. "I'm not here to absolve you," I said, "and I'm not reopening old wounds." He nodded. "I understand. And if there's going to be a place for you in my life," I added, "it will be on my terms. Respect isn't optional, apologies aren't symbolic, and presence matters more than intention." His shoulders dropped just slightly. "I'm sorry," he said. This time without qualifiers, without defenses. I exhaled. It didn't fix everything, it didn't erase the past, but it mattered. "Not tonight," I said gently, gesturing toward the hall behind me. "Tonight is mine, but there might be a tomorrow." He accepted that without protest. Mark joined me a moment later, slipping his hand into mine, as if it had always belonged there. My father nodded to him once, a quiet acknowledgement of the man who had changed the equation without ever raising his voice. We walked away together. In the months that followed, life continued messy, meaningful, unspectacular. I built programs. I listened to stories. I learned how much damage silence could do when it went unchecked. My father kept volunteering. We spoke occasionally, carefully, honestly, without urgency. There was no dramatic reconciliation. Just alignment. One spring morning, as Mark and I packed for a speaking engagement, my phone buzzed. A message from my father. I completed my first mentorship cycle at the VA, teaching young veterans how to advocate for themselves. It's humbling work. Thank you for showing me what service can look like. I stared at the screen for a long time before showing it to Mark. That's a different man, he said. Yes, I replied, and so am I. That evening, standing on another stage, looking out at a room full of faces, some hopeful, some weary, I told them the truth. I'd learned the hard way. Revenge is easy. It burns fast and leaves nothing behind. But real release takes patience. It takes boundaries. And sometimes it takes walking away from the need to be understood by the very people who should have known better. If someone once told you that you were a disgrace, if they refused to show up when it mattered, if their silence made you question your worth, hear this: you are not the sum of their judgment. You are the choices you make after it. And if this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear yours. Share your thoughts in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. We have many more stories like this to explore, stories about resilience, boundaries, and the quiet strength it takes to choose yourself. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and let's continue this journey together.